All right, so having examined the rise of conservatism after the fall of the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna and their domination of the continent and their attempts to suppress nationalism, I want to take a little bit of time to look at radical reactions to the Industrial Revolution and the domination of conservatism on the continent. So the first place we're going to kind of look at is French utopian socialism. French utopian socialism is very important in the fact that it lays the groundwork for what would become later socialism and eventually Marxism and communism, although it's not communist or it's not Marxist in and of itself. So we have to kind of understand this. It's interesting that socialism kind of has some of its origins in France, being that at the time, around 1815, French was lagging very much behind Great Britain industrialization. So that means the effects of industrialization were much more tempered than they were in Great Britain. But nonetheless, there was a strong reaction to laissez-faire industrialism and its encroachment in France. It's interesting to note that the French had, although not fully realizing it at the time, experimented a little bit with socialism during the radical phase of the revolution, during the emergency measures taken by the Republic in 1793 and 1794 that we discussed in class, had allowed the state to control industry that had already existed. It allowed the state to provide bread for the population. So there was already almost a history or an experience, a living experience in many of French people's minds of having gone through state kind of domination and control of an economy. There's also in radical French utopian socialism a call to help the poor, and that at the very least the state, although some of the radical French socialists will deny even the state's role, should be used to help the poor in the regulation of the rising inequalities coming with industrialization. So we're going to look at, and McKay looked at several important key figures of French utopian socialism. So we're going to examine a few that kind of led to these ideas that would later form into a greater ideal of socialist thought in Europe. Saint-Simon had this idea when he looked at society that society exists for the people, but yet there was an unequal distribution of power and wealth that was forming, much of a product of a modern time period, industrialization. And he made this argument that there were some people that were doers for society, some people that created a better society in which everybody could benefit from, and some people that acted essentially as parasites that would they would gobble and hoard up all the wealth and land and power into their own hands, leaving table scraps essentially for everybody else, essentially putting them into poverty. So these parasites that he would he labeled the court, and that being those around the king, or that used to be around the king, or those that are around the government in his time period, in the restored monarchy. Aristocracy, the landowners who'd always been kind of blamed, going all the way back to the origin of the French Revolution, for holding all that land and power and really not giving anything to society. If we think about French aristocratic exemptions to taxations, and yet they held so much of the wealth in France that we can kind of see them as parasites. Anyone that kind of like served in the government and helped the government maintain that power, and the church. And if you remember, the church had always charged a tithe to the people, and they took wealth out of France, but gave very little to none back to France. But then he also saw these, in his modern time period, there was these people that seemed to be creating a better society. He talked a lot about scientists and the rise of scientific thought. And with industry, we see the technology that people are slowly starting to see as an important part of their lives. Engineers, even industrialists who were building a greater society. And so he felt that when it came to government, that we should create a government in which the doers, these people that are actually creating something in modern society, should plan society, but with a very utilitarian slant. They should be empowered to plan society for the benefit of the whole. It's interesting to note that when he's talking about some of these doers in Great Britain, some of these doers are the people that are laying the groundwork for oppression of the workers in factories and mills. And so many people would disagree with his assertion that these doers could be inserted into power. It could benefit everybody, because in reality, as many English and British thinkers would argue, and certainly the workers would argue, that some of these could act very much like parasites. Um, the next is Louis Blanc, and Louis Blanc is the only French utopian socialist that will actually serve in government and have a real impact with his philosophies. Otherwise, everything else kind of remains in the philosophical realm. Um, he believed that, very much like the Chartists, are going to believe that the workers needed to gain voting rights. So in France, just like the Chartists in Great Britain, that the key to alleviating the problems of the workers and the poor was to have enfranchisement, to have control or say over government, and from there they could peacefully take over government. The theory being that the workers outnumber the wealthy, or the aristocracy, or even the powerful, and that they could take control of government from there, peacefully change the government to make their lives better. And he identified this idea that in industry, the workshops, the mills, the factories, those are places where in modern times people were being abused quite heavily. And so he thought that what you could do is you could take out essentially the private ownership of many of those factories, or at the very least create an alternative. And it would be a government-sponsored alternative. So there would be a factory or a mill that was run by the government that would basically be non-for-profit. And so then the profits would then be shared among the workers, increasing their wages and thus increasing their standard of living. So he believed government could do that, and on top of that, by creating these workshops, that government could create full employment, so there wouldn't be people without jobs. And if we think about what happened in Great Britain, that hopefully there wouldn't be people competing with each other for low-paying jobs that allowed many factory owners to abuse them. Proudhon is perhaps more radical when looking at these French utopian socialists. Proudhon argued that property in of itself was theft, and that there shouldn't be private property. And he broke in this idea that he felt that the power of the state was the real problem. He argued against the destruction of large nation states and large centralized governments, and rather argued for small communities that would kind of take care of themselves without the need, because if you live through communal living, without the need for private property, because private property was essentially one citizen stealing from another and denying their ability to make a living. Hold on here a second, make sure I get that right. I knew we skipped one. Fourier is another interesting French utopian socialist that we'll talk about. He's interesting in the sense that he's a little bit like Proudhon in that he believes that people should be living in small communities, but he takes it, inspired by science, to a large degree. He felt that you could calculate exactly what the size of a community should be, in which that everyone could be self-sustaining and no one would have to live in poverty. And he chose this number of 1,620 people that would be in these communities. And he even envisioned a world in which you would shuffle people around if necessary to kind of maintain these self-existing communities in which people wouldn't have to be oppressed. He also believed in equality to the point that he believed that marriage should be abolished, because he felt that all marriage did was oppress women and put them into a role in which they're subordinate to a man. He is calling essentially for a complete breakdown of the typical social order that existed. I mean, when you're talking institutions like marriage and the existence of a larger state, telling people to go into small communities like Proudhon was, this is very considered a radical thought. So neither of these men actually saw their dreams come true, but except for Louis Blanc to a very small extent, and it's going to be a failure, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But their theories and ideas are going to inspire others. And the important one we'll spend most of our time on is Marx. Marx and Engels, as we've read, were very critical of the Industrial Revolution. Having gone and seen the effects of the Industrial Revolution firsthand, they saw a world in which modern industry had oppressed people. The industrialists were oppressing others to keep them poor. But what was different about Marx was he saw a graded theme in history. Marx had been heavily influenced by Hegel, as we've discussed in this class, and Hegel had this idea of a dialectic, that history is driven by opposing forces the thesis that is opposed by an antithesis that destroy each other and create a synthesis, and when the synthesis is created, another antithesis is created, and there's this never-ending battle between opposing forces in society that drive history. For him, where he differed greatly with Hegel was he believed that these opposing forces were always economic. And as you're going to read in the Intro to Communist Manifesto, he lists out examples in which they were always in economic struggle, which he's eventually going to title The History is a Story of Class Struggle. And he saw in the Industrial Revolution the final stages of this class struggle, that what had been patrician and plebeian, what had been landowner and serf, is now become the bourgeoisie, this new middle class that at one point had freed itself from its own oppression, became the thesis, and is now oppressing the working class of the proletariat. So the owners of the means of production and the people who could only make their wealth off of their labor. He saw a final battle in history occurring between these two classes, that industry had to happen to bring this final battle. And he envisioned that one day the proletariat would realize that they were oppressed. They would develop a class consciousness where they realized they were all together, no matter who they were, no matter what their background, they were all workers, they were all together, and they were unified by their common oppression. They would rise up, and in this proletariat revolution, and Marx argued would be a violent one, because the bourgeoisie would never give up their wealth willingly. And then they would overthrow the governments that allowed the bourgeoisie to maintain their control, and then they would then share that wealth collectively. And so for Marx and Engels, they envisioned what they called a communist world in which the workers owned all the means of production. Profit was shared all equally among the workers, so there wasn't a need to work 16, 18 hours. People could work a few hours and they would go home and about their lives and avoid depression because profit wasn't the driving factor. Another reaction to conservatism in the rise of industry is the Romantic movement. The Romantic movement is seen as literature and art and philosophy. We're going to spend some time looking at the art later, but what's interesting about it is again, like art usually is again, a bit like Hegel's, new art comes to reject the old. McKay wrote about Romanticism that radical concepts of politics and society were accompanied by comparable changes in literature and other arts of this dual revolution. The Romantic movement was in part a revolt against classicism and the Enlightenment, a revolt against reason. Romantics kind of felt that reason had created this industrialized world that was artificial, that had rejected nature, and then in a lot of ways had created a lot of negatives, had created this ability to oppress the industrial worker, had created the pollution that was destroying nature. And so many of these Romantic thinkers wanted to appeal to something more natural, a more natural state. And it's going to be very strong leading up into to 1840s. And this more natural state really is an appeal to. They always try to appeal to emotion. They try to use their art and literature to reflect this idea of the individual and nature, to reject industry and the destruction that industry caused. And one of the most important impacts of Romanticism and thinking in art and music is going to be nationalism. Romanticism is going to find a strong foundation with nationalistic thinkers, because the idea was that they felt nationalism was almost something that existed in nature. It was real. It could be seen, as we read in Herdan Fichte's writing, that nationalism was formed by nature itself, by the rivers, by the valleys, by the streams, and that the powers that were oppressing nationalism were therefore the artificial and should be rejected. And many people try to go back to common folk tales, like for instance we have in the slide the Brothers Grimm, this idea that they were trying to find in their literature national stories, German national stories, German national fairy tales in which they could show that common national theme that's there. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about this when I return, and we'll look at some of the art.